So what would you say is kind of the most important thing? So if you were, talking to pastors and church leaders and you're like, here's my book and here's why I want you to have people in your congregation read it, what would your answer be for that?
I'll just use one example, and that's the transgender phenomenon. How do we answer the question, what does the church think and do, and how does the church minister to trans people? It's interesting because a number of us are writing independently about a theology of human embodiment, and yet we all agree on this one thing. So Timothy Tennant, the president of Asbury University, Sam Alberry, Preston Sprinkle, Nancy Piercy, John Kleinig, and a couple of others, we've all written independently of one another on this topic of human embodiment. We all agree that the church needs to answer the question about trans from a robust theology of human embodiment. If we don't have that, we're just trying to put band-aids on a problem, a phenomenon, a movement that is growing and growing and growing, and we're ill-equipped to answer just that one issue. So the whole idea that gender is self-constructed, gender is how I feel about myself. I'm a man, but I feel like a woman. How do we answer that kind of thing? As Timothy Tennant says in his book, our heart is deceitful above all things, Jeremiah 17, Jeremiah. And he said, but the body always tells the truth. And so a robust theology of human embodiment, I think, just to give one illustration, answers that, provides us with a theological and biblical grounding for ministering to trans people.
Yeah. So what would you say is kind of the underlying problem or issue of the way people are thinking when it comes to the subject of transgenderness?
They don't agree with my basic thesis that I am my body. So the basic thesis of the book, I am my body. Notice I didn't say I'm only my body, because like all of us here, I agree, we're a soul, body, spirit, body, soul, spirit, body unity, right? So there's both immaterial and material. But when I say I am my body, I mean that my identity is an embodied one, because God has designed human existence to be properly embodied. And so if we discount our embodiment, if we disagree with the idea, I am my body, then I can be anything I want to be. I as a man could be a woman. Liz as a woman could be a man. Brian, you as a man, you could be a cat or a dog or a St. Louis Cardinal, right? You just, whatever you want to invent, we invent our identities. Embodiment's not a given. Gender is not a given. Who we are, our identity, is something that we construct. And there's no end to the imagination of fallen human beings.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. So yeah, thanks for kind of setting out your thesis there. So when you get started, talking about I am my body, I think the book does a really helpful job of giving thought-provoking questions at the start of it, to think through these issues. So you have your thesis, and then you kind of dive into the image of God. I would say that's kind of foundational for understanding, who we are. How would you define or talk about the image of God? There's been countless ways people have talked about it, but how would Dr. Allison talk about the image of God for us?
So I'm looking at you, Brian. You're the image of God. You are the image of God in your whole being, not just a part of you like your reason or rationality or free will, not just you in relationship to your wife, to your kids, to friends and colleagues, not just in terms of the productive work that you do for Southern Seminary. Those are all aspects of it. But I'm looking at you as the image of God. God has created you as a holistic person, and you in your entirety reflect him in the world in which you live, and you represent him by your relationships, by your work, and so forth. So that's my take on the image of God, and it is our basic identity. And the thing about image bearing is embodied and it's gendered or sexed. There are only male embodied image bearers and female embodied image bearers. And so those are fundamental givens of life, and that's our identity.
Yeah, that's really helpful. How does this differ from maybe some I guess traditional arguments for image of God? This seems to be a more holistic. Are there any particular ones that you're kind of going against or kind of bringing together that would be helpful for people to understand?
Yeah, so you have in the early church the near equation of the image of God with one's intellect, reason, rationality, and free will, moral consciousness, things like that. So that's pretty much been the dominant view throughout church history, that the image of God is some aspect, some substance, some attribute of human existence. That's what it means to be in the image of God. Or then someone like a Karl Barth would say that the image of God is relationality. When God created human beings, when God created man, male and female, he created them. There's the image of God. It's relationships between men and women, and men and men, women and women. He's not talking sexually, just relationships, and then also with God. And then more recently, 20th century, particularly Old Testament scholarship is really focused on the image of God being exercising dominion, Genesis 1:28. So the image of God is the fact that we're working and we're exercising dominion over the rest of the created order. And I agree with all those as aspects of the image of God. But when I read Genesis 1:26 through 28, I mean, when God actualizes his purpose to create a being more like him than any other being, what does he create? He creates human beings in their entirety, in their wholeness. That to me says then that we are the image of God. So Liz, this morning when she woke up, she looks at herself in the mirror, she sees an image of God. She sees the image of deity, sees herself, she's it. Yes, in her relationships, yes, in her work, yes, in her rationality and reason and all like that, but she's it, just like Brian, you're it.
That's really helpful. So we go from image of God, and then the I would say not controversial, like one of the big topics is the gendered body. And you've said, we're gendered all the way through and through, male and female. So there's a question that came in. If someone comes to you and says, I'm agendered, I'm not gendered, or maybe a son or a daughter comes and says that to a parent, how would a Christian parent, that you're teaching in the church, how would you help them understand what to say to a child or a teenager that's struggling with that?
First, Preston Sprinkle has just come out with an exceptionally good book on this topic. That's going to provide a lot of resources for people. I think couple key things. Parents dealing with children, first of all, don't be shocked and get angry and lose it and scold and punish and whatever. Listen well for a while, for a long time, because the last thing in the world that you want to do is break off the relationship. When that's gone, everything's lost, isn't it? So be very careful in expressing chagrin or rejection. Understand where your child is coming from, and then read some good resources and talk to your child from the wisdom from those resources. Things like God has created us as image bearers, embodied as men and women. Just different things like that, and assure their children of continued love and support. We would never, I would say, we would never yield to our children's request for, if they're prepubescent, taking puberty blockers. Would certainly never yield to our children's desire for some kind of sex change operation, at that point we'd have to say, I can't support you. I love you, but I can't support you destroying your embodiment. So those are just a couple of highlights.
That's really helpful. I think, as a parent of, a 2-year-old, almost 3-year-old, thinking about, these issues for the future. And I know there's, parents in here that are probably, dealing with that now. It's not just the outside world struggling how to think through it. It's parents and people in our church thinking through it as well. So.
And I think too, let's realize teenagers, adolescents go through identity crises. I mean, this is just commonplace. And I think the latest example of this, the latest manifestation of this is this questioning of their own gender. There's gender dysphoria, gender confusion, gender incongruence, whatever you want to call it, just confusion. And realize, again, don't overreact, but realize that in the vast, vast majority of cases, our adolescent children grow out of that phase. According to the DSM-5, 98% of adolescent boys and 88% of adolescent girls who have struggled at some point in their adolescence with their gender identity come out of it and fully embrace their created gender. So you can look at it also as it's a rough phase, but in the vast majority of cases, it will dissipate.
No, that's really helpful. So related to the gender discussion, there's you talk about the particular properties of male and female, and one of your parts of the discussion is that there's no properties that are exclusive to male and female. Can you explain that out? What you mean by that, and why you think that's important for the church today to understand?
I think this is one of the most interesting and most controversial parts of my book.
That's why I asked it.
Yeah, I know. It's the St. Louis Cardinals in you, right? Yes. Get back at the Cubs fan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So apart from reproductive matters, okay, let's bracket that. We all know physiologically, genetically, hormonally, chromosomally, we're different men and women. So bracketing that, apart from the reproductive capabilities, there are no specific human capacities, no specific human properties that are unique to men and women. By specific human capacities, I mean rationality, intellect, emotions, feelings, sentiments, will, volition, motivations, purposing. By common human properties, I mean love and compassion, initiative, protectiveness, compassion, gentleness, things like that, common human virtues and things like that. So, but these common human capacities and common human properties will always be expressed by men in a male way and by women in a female way. So gentleness, Liz and Brian, you should be expressing gentleness. That's a fruit of the Spirit. This isn't something reserved for women. It's not something reserved for men. It's a common human property, a common Christian virtue, a common fruit of the Spirit, an attribute exhibited by Jesus himself. But Brian, you're going to express gentleness in a certain way. Liz is going to express gentleness in another way. Brian, because you're a man, and Liz, because she's a woman. And so we are gendered all the way down. We will express these capacities and these properties in gendered ways, but there's no list. We can say these are female properties and these are male properties. I dissent strongly from that view.
Yes, you do. Yeah, no, that's. I think it's really helpful for understanding that. I think it also relates to. Or did you have something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, I would just say, notice I didn't say anything about roles.
Right.
Right. Yeah. The discussion always devolves into discussion. Yes, but women are to do this, but men are to do this. Yes, agreed. We may even agree completely 100% on the roles, but that doesn't identify us, does it? We talked about identity being embodied, gendered, image bearing. which doesn't have anything to with roles. Roles will be manifested in certain contexts, but that's a secondary issue. And one of my big complaints is that's the focus. It's almost the only thing we talk about. And I just think that's a secondary conversation. We need to talk about what about these common human capacities and properties, first of all.
Yeah, that's good. So I am going to ask about the role. There's a question in the chat. So we have that. So but how does that inform how we understand roles in the context of the church or the context of family? How does that help inform for our context complementarianism for that?
Yeah. So in addition to these common human capacities like intellect and rationality, emotions, sentiments, will, and things like that, and in addition to these common human properties like gentleness and collaboration and self-sacrifice and love, right? There's biblical instruction about roles regarding husbands and wives. So there's an authority submission relationship in the family between husband and wife. And then in the church, our understanding is that only qualified men are to serve in the role of elders. So there's biblical teaching about those roles, right? But more fundamentally, I think we need to understand that in the church, we are together equal as image bearers, equal in terms of our salvation in Jesus Christ, equal in terms of the giftings of the Holy Spirit. And we are to treat one another as brothers and sisters. We're family. And then in particular contexts, leadership in the church, the leadership in the home, there are specific roles outlined for us in Scripture.
Yeah, that's a good way to help think through that relationship there. So also, then you also have Jesus, who was gendered. How does that discussion, when we're looking at the life of Jesus and we're thinking through gender, how do we think through that? I think the particularities actually help that conversation when we're thinking about Jesus in that. But how does using him as our ultimate image bearer, what it means to be a true image bearer, how do we hopefully understand that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the key issues, how does Jesus die for both men and women if he's a man, right? How can he, as a male, understand, sympathize with, die for women? And again, I come back to the fact that he, as a fully human being, shares all of the same common human capacities and common human properties: mind, will, emotions, purposing, motivations, gentleness, compassion, love, initiative, self-sacrifice, etc., etc. Yes, he expresses those as a man, right? But he is able to sympathize with us because of the commonalities that he shares with us. And this is not to minimize his particularities. The fact that he's the Son of God who came 2,000 years ago, born of woman, born under the law to rescue us, is extremely important. But he's able to be a particular God-man in order to rescue us. He's the second Adam. He's the one who undoes the disobedience of Adam. He's the Son of God who takes on the sins of the world. All of these particularities are part of the genius of God's rescue plan for us.